Hello everybody. In today's video, I will be explaining to you how to calculate the float of an activity. I would advise you to have a look at the earlier video I had posted on my channel to help you gain a better understanding of this video. To begin with, the concept of float. As far as float is concerned, float is defined as the amount of time an activity in a project can be delayed without delaying the project. In order to calculate the float of an activity, there are certain basic concepts which you would need to go through, beginning with the forward pass and the backward pass. I'll be explaining to you how to conduct a forward pass and how to conduct a backward pass. So let's focus on the forward pass for now. In order to calculate the forward pass, you would need to know what an early start and an early finish is of an activity. The early start of an activity is the earliest time that that activity could start. It is represented at the location below. The early finish of an activity is the earliest time an activity can finish. The early finish of an activity is shown at this location. The duration of an activity is the amount of time it would take to complete an activity. The duration is shown at this location. Now, let's calculate the early start and early finish. So this is a network diagram with three activities. Activity A having a duration of 2 days, Activity B having a duration of 5 days, and Activity C having a duration of 3 days. When we calculate the early start or the early finish of these activities, we would first begin with the first activity in the network. And as you can see here, the first activity is Activity A. Because this is the first activity of the project, that is why the early start of this activity would be 0. That's because the earliest point of time that the first activity can start is at time 0. So remember that the early start of the first activity of a project is 0. The next thing we are going to do now is to calculate the early finish of this activity. The early finish of an activity is equal to the early start of the activity plus the duration of the activity. So if we had to calculate the early finish of activity A, this would be the early start of activity A, which is 0, plus the duration of the activity, which is 2. So the early finish of this activity would be equal to 2. This is the formula. Early finish is equal to early start plus the duration. We're now going to go ahead to activity B. Because we're going ahead, this is exactly why this method is known as the forward pass. So let's focus on activity B now. The early start of activity B would be the early finish of the activity before it. And as you can see in this diagram, that the activity before B is A. And the early finish of A is 2 days. So you just take this number and put it in the box ahead. So the early start of activity B would be equal to 2. The early finish of this activity would be equal to 7. That's because a 2 plus 5 is equal to 7. 2 being the early start of activity B and 5 being the duration of the activity. The early start of activity C would be 7. That's because the early finish of activity B is 7. And the early finish of activity C would be equal to 10. 7 plus 3 is equal to 10. Remember that the early finish of the last activity of the project is the duration of the project. And in this example, as you can see, that the early finish of the last activity, which is activity C, is 10 days. Hence, the duration of this project is 10 days. Now, this was a fairly simple network diagram. Let's try to calculate the early start and the early finish of this network diagram. So we're going to start with the first activity, which is activity A. As is the first activity, its early start is equal to 0. The early finish of this activity would be 2, because 0 plus 2 is equal to 2. The early start of the next activities, B and C, would be the early finish of A. As you can see that the early finish of A is 2 days, so the early start of activity B and C would be 2 days. The early finish of activity B would be 2 plus 5, which is equal to 7. And the early finish of activity C would be 2 plus 3, which is equal to 5. We're now going to ascertain what the early start of activity D would be. In order to start activity D, we would have to finish both activity B and activity C. At which day would both activity B and activity C finish? They would both be finished at day 7, and that is exactly why the early start of this activity would be D. Could we have put 5? Of course not, because if we would have put 5, activity B would not have finished. Activity B finishes at day 7. So the early start of activity D would be 7 days. You basically put the higher value of the preceding early finishes. The early finish of activity D would be 7 plus 3, which is equal to 10. You now know how to conduct the forward pass of an activity. We'll go ahead now and understand how to conduct a backward pass. As you can understand from the name, since it's a backward pass, so we'll be basically doing the calculation backwards. There are two concepts which you need to know, the late start and the late finish. The late start of an activity is the latest time an activity can start. The late start of an activity is shown here. The late finish of an activity is the latest time that that activity could finish. And that would be shown here. Now, if we have a network diagram with 3 activities, we have already calculated the early start and the early finish of these activities. We're now going to calculate the late start and the late finish. We begin this by calculating the late finish of the last activity. And as you can see, the last activity here is activity C. The late finish of the last activity would be the early finish of the activity. And as you can see, as far as activity C is concerned, the early finish of this activity is 10. So we just take this number 10 and put it down. So the late finish of activity C would be equal to 10 days. We're going to go backwards and now calculate the late start of this activity. The late start of activity C would be equal to 10 minus the duration of the activity, which is 3 days, which would be equal to 7. This is the formula. The late start of an activity is equal to the late finish of the activity minus its duration. We're going to go backwards now and calculate the late finish of activity B. The late finish of activity B would be the late start of the next activity. So since the late start of activity C is 7, the late finish of activity B would be equal to 7. The late start of activity B would be 7 minus the duration of the activity, and that would be 2 days, because 7 minus 5 is equal to 2. The late finish of activity A would be 2 days, because the late start of activity B is 2 days. We're going backwards, right? And the late start of activity A would be 2 minus 2, which is equal to 0. This was a fairly simple network diagram. We're going to go ahead and try calculating the late start and the late finish of the activities on this network diagram. The early start and early finishes have already been calculated. We're going to now calculate the late finish and the late start of these activities. So we're going to start with the last activity on the network diagram, which is activity D. The late finish of this activity would be the early finish of the activity. And since the early finish of the activity D is 10, the late finish of this activity would be 10. The late start of activity D would be 10 minus the duration of the activity, 10 minus 3, and this would be equal to 7. Since you're going backwards, this value 7 would help us in the calculation of the late finish of activity B and activity C. So we're going to take the 7 and put it here. The late finish of activity B is 7 and the late finish of activity C is 7. The late start of activity B would be 7 minus 5, which is equal to 2. And the late start of activity C would be 7 minus 3, which is equal to 4. Now, in order to calculate the late finish of activity A, we can see that there are two values, 2 and 4. Now, the latest point of time that this activity could finish would be equal to 2. That's because of the fact that the latest time activity B could start would be 2. Activity B cannot start at day 3, because if we would do that, the project would get delayed. And that is exactly why the late finish of activity A is equal to 2. You basically put the lower value. And the late start of this activity A would be equal to 0 days. That's because the 2 minus 2 is equal to 0. Let's go ahead and calculate the float of an activity. As you can see that this is an activity, and the early start, early finish, late start, late finish are shown at these locations within an activity. And you already know that the float of an activity is the amount of time that the activity could be delayed without having a delay of the project. The formula for calculating the float of an activity is the late finish of the activity minus the early finish of the same activity, or the late start of the activity minus the early start of the activity. Let's calculate the float of each of these activities, starting with activity A. So the float of activity A would be the late finish of A minus the early finish of A. The late finish of A is 2 and the early finish of A is 2. And hence the float of this activity would be 0. Let's calculate the float of B. So this would be the late finish of activity B minus the early finish of activity B. That would be 7 minus 7, which is equal to 0. And the float of activity C would be 10 minus 10, 0. The float of each of these activities is 0. So the question here is that could we be delaying any of these activities? Of course not. Why? Because its float is 0. I've already explained to you that the float of an activity is the amount of time that that activity could be delayed without delaying the project. And since the float of each of these activities is 0, this means we could not be delaying any of these activities. If we did delay any of these activities, that would delay the project. And since time is one of the project constraints, it's very important to ensure that the project finishes on time. In this network diagram, let's calculate the float of activity C. As you can see here, as far as activity C is concerned, the late finish of activity C is 7 days and early finish of activity C is 5 days. So the float of this activity would be 7 minus 5, which is equal to 2. Could we be delaying activity C? Of course we can. Why? Because it has a float. And by how many days could we be delaying this activity without delaying the project? We could be delaying it by 2 days. That's because the float of this activity is 2 days. Let's calculate the float of activities in this network diagram. The float of activity A would be equal to 0 because the 2 minus 2 is equal to 0. The float of activity B would be equal to 0 because the 7 minus 7 is equal to 0. And the float of activity D would also be equal to 0 because the 10 minus 10 is equal to 0. If you look closely, you can realize that activities A, B are on the critical path. It's hence important for you to understand that the float of an activity on the critical path is 0. That's because that none of the activities on a critical path could be delayed. If we delayed any of the activities on the critical path, the project would get delayed. Thank you so much for your time. You now know how to calculate the float of the activities on a network diagram and identify by how many days could each of the activities be delayed without delaying the project.